Okay, the time is now 10:03. I recognize that a quorum of the Pension Review Board is present, and the Pension Review Board meeting will now come to order. Before we move into the agenda, just a couple of housekeeping items. Probably most importantly, the fact that everyone realizes this meeting is not in person and we are still meeting remotely. We do encourage all participants and listeners to please mute your microphones or telephones when you are not speaking. Also, before you speak, please state your name. And we do, appreciate in advance any patience extended as any technical issues may arise. Please know that we will try to resolve these technical issues immediately. At this time, I'd like to call on Ashley Rendon to do the roll call of the board members.
Thank you. Chair Stephanie Leiby.
Present.
Keith Brainerd.
Here.
Marcia Dush.
Here.
Rosie Farina Strauss. I saw her. There you are. And Ernest Richards.
Present.
Christopher Zook.
Present.
Thank you.
Very good. And now we'll call on Ashley again to provide a roll call of any members of the public who have pre-registered to provide comments at today's meeting.
Thank you. We have pre-registered Mr. David Stacy. He's indicated that he may provide comments.
Perfect. Is that the only pre-registration?
Yes, sorry.
Okay. And now at this time, are there any members of the public who are on the phone now who did not pre-register would like to provide comments at today's meeting? Okay. Hearing none, we'll move on to our first board administrative matter, which is approval of the June 30, 2020 minutes. For my fellow board members, we will have a motion on this item. If you make or second the motion, please identify yourself first. So at this time, the chair entertains a motion to suspend the reading of the minutes.
Ernest Richards, second.
Sorry, did I have Ernest, did you make the motion?
I so move.
Okay, perfect.
Marcia Dush, second.
Okay, the motion has been made by Mr. Richards and seconded by Mrs. Dush to suspend the reading of the minutes. Is there any discussion from the board or any corrections of the minutes as circulated? Okay, hearing none, a motion has been made by Mr. Richards and seconded by Mrs. Dush to suspend the reading of the minutes. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and the minutes will not be read. The minutes are approved as circulated. Next item on our administrative agenda is recognition of one of our outgoing board members. Sherry Shivers has resigned from the board, and at this time, we'd like to read a resolution of the board that thanks her for the service that she's provided during her time with us. So the resolution states, whereas the State Pension Review Board has been honored by the appointment of many distinguished citizens to serve terms amongst its memberships. Whereas Ms. Sherry O. Shivers was appointed as a member of the State Pension Review Board by Governor Greg Abbott on September 4th, 2019. And whereas Ms. Shivers has served with distinction in her role on the investment committee, and whereas the members of the board believe that Mrs. Shivers' loyal and outstanding service to the board, the public employees, and other citizens of the state deserves special recognition. Now, therefore, be it resolved, the board extends deepest gratitude and appreciation to Sherry O. Shivers for her devoted service and exemplary leadership, and wish her the very best for the future.
Beautiful.
Okay. And I knew, was Sherry able to join us today?
Good morning, members. Yes, we did reach out to her, but unfortunately, she was not able to make it to the meeting today.
Okay, very well. And with that, we will continue to the next item on our agenda, which is actuarial committee matters. And I call on Vice Chair Brainerd to lead us through this agenda item.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'd like to ask Kenny Herbold to provide the actuarial valuation report, please.
Thank you. Good morning, members. This is Kenny Herbold, staff actuary. For those following along, if I can direct you to slide 20 in the packet. This is the summary information, excuse me. This is the summary information of our AV reports. I don't have a whole lot of prepared remarks. I just have a couple of quick items I want to talk about, and then I'll take questions on any of the AV reports that we have. So I just wanted to note that we have 36 new AVs since our June board meeting, mostly reflecting 2019 returns. And we see that it resulted in a slight uptick in the funded ratio. We also noticed that the deferred losses are much closer. So market value of assets and actuarial value of assets are significantly closer than they were when we were reflecting 2018. So 2019 returns were generally good for most plans, and a lot of those plans have deferred gains at the moment, and that's what we're seeing. So I will say, though, that these numbers don't reflect TRS's most recent valuation at the end of August. It doesn't reflect ERS also at the end of August. The 3 Houston plans we are expecting to get, those are June 30 numbers. So we do expect to get those over the next couple of months. So there'll be another shift next time we see these numbers, because those will all be reflected. So those will all be a lot of 2020 numbers. So will be the first returns that we see that include the COVID impact from earlier in this year. The other item I did want to note, though, is that even though we are seeing good returns in 2019, that also reflecting 14 of the 36 valuations that we received include discount rate reductions. Most of them are 25 to 50 basis points. And so at the bottom of the page there, you can see some shifting down in the numbers on our discount rates. And so that we're moving down towards a closer average to 7%, 7.25 is generally where a lot of those are headed. So that's pretty much all I have at this moment. There's not a ton to report on in this particular item, since we have a very specific things to talk about in the FSRP report, as well as some of the other things that others will be presenting on. So I'm more than happy to take questions.
Kenny, this is Marcia Dush. Not really a question, but a couple of observations. And I know we will be talking about the changes to potential changes to FSRP rules. But I do want to make an observation. I looked at the rest of the actuarial valuation report, and just a couple of observations. We do have 6 plans that are less than 40% funded on their actuarial valuation. We have another 8 plans that are between 40 and 50% funded. And then there are another 8 plans that they are not less than 50% funded from an actuarial valuation standpoint, but their GASB funded status is less than 50%. I personally am, as the actuary, am concerned about plans that are poorly funded. I would like to see us continue our intensive reviews and maybe focus on these plans. I know many of these plans have already had an intensive review. I would like to see updates on the plans that have already been through an intensive review. And I guess a question is, particularly on the plans that have had an intensive review, will there be some sort of update to the legislature on those plans.
Good morning, members. Again, Anumeha Kumar. Marsha, with regards to the intensive review plans, yes, we will be including, and we did that in our last biennial report as well, an update on the system, on those systems. And for the actuarial committee meeting, if the board so wishes, we can include as part of our regular report to the actuarial committee an update on the intensive review plans, an annual update maybe on those intensive review plans to help those systems.
I would like to see that, Chairman Brainerd, and again, I would like to see us start some intensive reviews, perhaps focusing on some of these poorly funded plans.
I agree, Marcia. I appreciate your questions and your remarks, and I hope in the new year that we can revisit the issue of these intensive reviews and possibly begin them again.
Thank you.
Other questions for Kenny, the staff actuary, right now? Hearing none, I'd like to ask Kenny to talk about systems subject to the FSRP requirement, please.
Thank you, Chair Brainerd. If I can direct you to slide 35. I will say we have not had any new FSRPs submitted since the June board meeting. Excuse me. So we're starting with these are the plans that are currently subject to the FSRP requirement. Just a few updates on these plans. Irving Fires came to our September actuarial committee meeting and provided an update on their status. They have indicated that they're focusing they're working with the plan sponsor to make plan changes as well as lower their assumptions, or start using more conservative assumptions. So they indicated that they're lowering their assumed rate of return, payroll growth rate, those types of things. They are making some changes to their drop accounts. They've added a second tier. The city has increased contributions. So they are still in the process of developing the full FSRP, but they are making changes right now. They just haven't submitted a complete FSRP yet. Midland Fire came to our August committee meeting to provide an update. They did provide a pretty thorough historical background of what put them in the place that they're currently in. They noted some staffing and payroll issues. And they are working with their plan sponsor as well. The plan sponsor was our August committee meeting. They have indicated there were some delays due to COVID, and so, but they are still in the process of completing their FSRP. Longview Fire has informed us of having some COVID-related budget constraints, and they have not submitted any additional information since our last board meeting. Orange Fire came to our August actuarial committee meeting. They noted that they have made some changes recently. The city and the plan are working together and still working toward making additional changes. Marshall Fire provided a letter to us in late June, so right around the time of our last board meeting, indicating that the employees had increased their contributions. They haven't submitted a formal FSRP yet reflecting these additional contributions. We're expecting a 12/31/2020 actuarial evaluation, and we haven't been informed if they're going to submit something prior to that or not. Based on some back of the envelope calculations that we have done internally, it looks like these, depending on how their assets fall at 12/31/2020, these employee contributions are likely to be sufficient to cover them, but I don't know if there's any additional changes that they're considering. And then finally, Beaumont Fire has made quite a few changes. They've been looking through a number of studies, their actuary performed a number of different studies to look at benefit changes. They have already approved a contribution increase schedule over the next 4 years, ending in October of 2023. So I guess it's 3 years now. So they're making changes on the contribution side that have already been approved. They have an election this month to discuss additional benefit changes as well. So they're making changes to the active employee benefits, primarily on the drop side, and they're looking at implementing the new tier for new hires as well. So we expect to get final information from them in the next month or two. And then we have two additional plans that have been added to this list: the Dallas Employees Retirement Fund and Plainview Fire. Both of those, a big part of the reason for their jump in their amortization period has been a reduction in their discount rate, as well as some additional changes to their assumptions. And that, so those had an impact. We sent out notification letters to both of the plans, and we're waiting to hear back on what those plans are, what their expected plans are for meeting their FSRP. Slide 36 shows systems that are currently at risk. So these are all the plans, again, that have at least one valuation with an amortization period above 40. Sorry, their most recent valuation with an amortization period above 40. There are a number of plans on there, but we'll keep an eye on those. And then slide 37 those are the plans that are currently working towards completing their FSRP. And you'll notice Odessa Fire has submitted a valuation with an amortization period below 40. So they will be dropping off this list. So just as a reminder, we include them here so we can see that, the change. And then the next meeting, they'll be on the last page on slide 38, which is just a list of the plans that have already completed their FSRP and have moved off that list. So those are all my prepared remarks for the Funding Soundness Restoration Plan report. I'm more than happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Kenny. Sounds like there is some pockets of progress there. Appreciate the update. Questions for Kenny on the FSRP update? I have one question, Kenny. Can you please remind me, under current statute, when we would expect to hear from Dallas and Plainview?
Sorry, I was muted. Yes, on slide 35, we have the due date of the FSRP in the far right column. So Dallas's FSRP is due in January, and Plainview's is due in March. And so this due date is essentially 6 months following the adoption of the trigger valuation. So those were, so we're hoping to hear back from them relatively soon.
Have we been given any reason to believe we won't hear from them by those dates?
We haven't had any conversations with them yet, so we don't know what they're working on at this moment.
Thank you. Other questions for Kenny? Kenny, thank you. Next item on the agenda, funding policies received as required by statute. Members, you may recall that the last legislative session, pursuant to a recommendation from this board, the legislature passed a bill requiring pension plans in the state to develop and submit to the PRB funding policies. And I'd ask Anu to please update us on those. Anu, please.
Thank you, Chair Brainerd. Members, the funding policy report starts on page 39 of your packet. The report hasn't changed much since the June meeting. We have received a few more funding policies, like Austin Employees Retirement Systems, and Austin Police updated their funding policy as well. Overall, we have received funding policies from most of our systems, and staff has been in contact with a couple of plans that are still working on theirs. I also wanted to quickly mention that over the course of multiple meetings, the actuarial committee identified and raised concerns to the systems using a rolling ADC benchmark. Several systems updated their funding policies to switch from a rolling ADC to a closed period benchmark. However, some other systems decided to keep it. The committee did not go as far to include its concern as a legislative recommendation, but will report its concern in general regarding the use of a rolling ADC benchmark to the legislature in the biennial report. And that concludes my remarks, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Questions for Anu on the update to the funding policies? I think by and large, this has been a success. This has been the first time that we ventured into this. My view going into this was that every pension plan ought to have a funding policy, basically a roadmap to get to full funding. And I really appreciate the thought and effort that went into it among the retirement systems, the guidance and assistance that was provided by the PRB staff. And I think that we're in a much better place, all of us, today as opposed to 2 years ago. Thanks for your work on it. Other questions on funding policies for me? If not, I'd like to move on, Madam Chairman, to item 5B on our agenda, recommended changes to the FSRP per statute. And I just would like to briefly introduce this, Madam Chairman. Discussion of FSRP changes begins on page 55 of the packet. As you know, this board has a statutory mandate to recommend policy changes that the board believes are appropriate. We are the only state level advocate for adequate pension funding being a sponsor's priority. The Actuarial Committee is recommending board approval of some changes that we'll talk about in detail in a few minutes to FSRP statutes, incorporating comments and input from public retirement systems, their consultants, and other stakeholders that we believe would improve current funding policy and FSRP statutory requirements. The Actuarial Committee believes that we could revise our guidelines, and then we could not revise our guidelines and stay silent, but we have to update the FSRP standards in order to remain consistent with our funding guidelines. Personally, I'm proud of the work the committee and the staff has done on this. We've engaged in what I believe is a transparent process, holding multiple meetings to deliberate. We've had a lot of discussions, solicited public comment regarding these proposed recommendations. We listened to systems like Midland Fire regarding concerns such as the amount of time that it takes to work with all parties to develop a well-considered plan, and updated the recommendation to accommodate those concerns. The board has made a promise that the revised funding guidelines with a 30-year threshold would not be effective until 2025, and the committee is working to make sure that we honor that pledge. We realize these are difficult times, particularly fiscally, and plan sponsors are facing budgetary constraints. But the Pension Review Board is a steward of responsible pension funding to help ensure promised benefits can be paid for. And the proposed recommendations we'll be looking at in a moment, we believe are long overdue and would help systems continue to move in the right direction of full funding. We're going to consider 5 possible statutory changes. And Madam Chairman, if it's acceptable to you, I'd like to proceed by asking staff first to walk us through these changes. And I would also invite board members to ask questions along the way. Then I'd like to allow any members of the public to weigh in. And after we've heard from members of the public, and members of the board can discuss these changes, and we'll work to reach consensus on recommendations. So if that is acceptable, I would ask Michelle Downey-Cranes to begin the discussion.
Thank you, Chairman Brainerd, and good morning, Madam Chair and members. I'm Michelle Downey-Cranes, Deputy Director. As Chair Brainerd covered, we've come a long way on these. At the June board meeting, you'll remember staff presented 10 issues for board consideration to potentially improve the effectiveness of the funding policy and FSRP requirements in statute. Since that meeting, the Actuarial Committee studied similar requirements in other states and worked with stakeholders to bring the board the legislative recommendations on page 55 of the packet. We've also included the previous version of the document, which had expressed these issues in policy objectives, as well as the public comments that we received, which I want to note were very helpful, and many have been incorporated into the recommendations. I have to say, when we started this process, I had no idea where we would end up, and these evolved a lot from where we started. And I believe that's because of the contributions from the public retirement community in Texas that we have the following comprehensive legislative reform package to bring you. So I'd like to go through the 5 areas on page 55 and answer any questions you may have. In the introduction of the document, we've included language that would go along with the recommendations in the biennial report to provide some background and establish the board's intent. So first, the committee made one recommendation to change the funding policy requirement in statute, and that would add the sponsor to the process. This would align the funding policy requirement with the FSRP requirement, which of course the FSRP is required to be developed by both the plan and its sponsor, so that in the end, both key parties would have full ownership in the long-term funding plan, the funding policy, and a remediation plan if one became necessary. And I do want to note here that this recommendation wouldn't make sense for certain systems, such as the state's agent multi-employer plans, which, as you know, don't have one single sponsor. And we would work to ensure that the legislature, that was communicated to the legislature should these recommendations be taken up. Moving on to the FSRP recommendations, the changes under number 2 would again tie the 2 requirements together and enhance the sponsor's role by requiring the city council to adopt the FSRP and requiring that a plan and sponsor subject to FSRP would have to collaborate on a revised funding policy to ensure that funding levels don't deteriorate again. Moving to the next page, section 3 would, thank you, Ashley, would bring the threshold and target for the FSRP to 30 years in line with PRB guidelines. However, it would phase in that transition, as Chair Brainerd explained. As of 2025, the FSRP would be triggered immediately by amortization periods over 40 years, or between 30 and 40 with a funded ratio of less than 65%. Plans with amortization periods between 30 and 40 years and funded ratios of 65% or higher would still have several consecutive valuations before triggering an FSRP, as they do in current law.
Michelle, this is
Yes.
Martha Dush. I just would like you to clarify that provision for the plans with 30 to 40 years and a funded ratio over 65. Is what you are saying there that no FSRP will be triggered before 9/1/25, but would you be looking back to some valuations before 9/1/25 to count toward that 3 or 2 year requirement?
I think that that's possible, given that the original bill establishing the FSRP included a look back of that nature, that the legislature might consider doing the same in this case. So we haven't explicitly addressed that, but again, with what we have said in the policy recommendations is that the goal of 30 years would not have to be achieved until 2025. So which valuations counted and if there was a look back, I think is something the legislature would consider if it were taken up as a bill.
All right,
and that a look back is certainly possible. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. So staying with number 3 here, The committee also wanted to give credit for serious reforms already made by exempting plans such as Fort Worth employees that are already in the process of implementing a contribution policy that uses the ADC and whose valuations clearly show that they're moving towards full funding. I realize that section 3 has a lot in it, so if there's any other questions, I'm happy to take those now, or at the end. I would be moving to section 4 now. The changes in section 4 would streamline the FSRP process, as well as allow a more realistic timeline for development of the plan. So we heard clearly from plans and sponsors that negotiating meaningful reforms took time. And the recommendation here originally had extended it from 6 months to a year. And we worked with Chair Leiby to bring an alternative recommendation today of 2 years. And that was based on plans experience working through the process. That goes along with, should you adopt the 2-year timeframe, the next recommendation, which would require that future actions, which is something we had spent a good amount of time talking about previously, future actions necessary for the FSRP to work, such as votes for benefit or contribution changes, would have to be completed during those 2 years. That said, FSRPs could certainly still include phased-in contribution increases over time. The next change came directly from the public comments and would change the 10-year period to reach the target to 2 years from the triggering valuation. This change, members, we believe would go far to eliminate the problem of revised FSRPs. So instead of a revised FSRP, if the goal were not, if folks were not on track to hit the goal over 10 years, instead of that, failure to achieve the target would trigger a new FSRP. And the committee established that should that happen within 10 years of the first FSRP, the second FSRP would need to include stricter measures such as risk sharing, ADC-based contributions, or essentially components that automatically react to negative plan experience. Finally, on the last page, the recommendations in section 5 would provide PRB and stakeholders with the documentation necessary to evaluate the FSRP. It would also clarify that ASOPs must be followed with respect to the assumptions used, and specify that the plan and sponsor should share the cost of the analysis. That concludes my prepared presentation, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Michelle, this is Marcia Dush again. And again, I guess this is just my concern or my thought. If there is a bill, I really would like to see that the legislature could find a way to help the systems that have already adopted an FSRP and are seriously working toward achieving a 40-year amortization. And also that systems that become subject to an FSRP and that they put in the effort to adopt an FSRP before a bill is passed. However, if they fall off their path, then they should be subject to the new rules. But I would like to see the legislature take into consideration those that are diligently working under the current rules.
Thank you, Ms. Dush. And we can make sure that if the recommendations are taken up by the legislature, that we communicate to the bill author the committee's intent to grandfather systems that have made a serious attempt through their FSRP reform and that are on track towards their goal.
Thank you.
Sure.
Members, I'd like to give the members of the public an opportunity to weigh in, and I would point out that in your board packet beginning on page 59 is additional detailed description of these changes, these proposed changes. that is accompanied by comments that we received from stakeholders. And so at this time, I'd like to ask if anybody is within the sound of my voice who'd like to weigh in, share your thoughts on any of these, please. Ashley, can you remind us, for those who are on the telephone, of how to weigh in?
Yes, if you are on the telephone and you're muted right now, you can push *6 to unmute yourself.
*6. Thank you. This will not be your last opportunity to weigh in. And if there's no one who wishes to weigh in right now, I'd like to see if we can reach a consensus on some of these among members of the board. So Michelle, work with us here, please. Item 1, can you briefly state the issue with item 1?
I'm sorry, briefly restate item 1?
Yes, please.
Sure. So item 1 relates to the funding policy requirement and would add the sponsor to that requirement.
Thank you. So the primary issue here, if I might just summarize it, is that providing a pension plan really requires at least 2 entities, the pension plan, but also the plan sponsor. The pension plan does not have authority to fund the plan. That comes from the plan sponsor. And under current arrangements, all of the work is left up to the pension plan. And I think the primary complaint we heard with regard to this issue is that the sponsor, there's no requirement in law that the sponsor be involved in supporting the FSRP or the funding policy. And so what we'd like to do is recommend to the legislature that the plan sponsor be added to the FSRP requirements and the funding policy requirements. Questions, discussion on that?
I just have a quick question, Mr. Vice Chair. By adding the sponsor, I'm just wondering about unintended consequences in the event of a lawsuit. If somebody would bring a lawsuit against the plan, would that also affect, or how would that affect the sponsor?
What kind of a lawsuit might be brought against the plan? What are you thinking, Lenny?
For example, if there is a malfeasance or there is a negligence or any number of breaches, will it tie in the sponsor also as a co-defendant? At this time, the sponsor will not be a co-defendant, but I'm just wondering, is that something that could happen?
I'm not a lawyer, but I believe these pension plans are created by or authorized by the plan sponsor. And I don't know that what we're talking about here would have make any change in the legal status in terms of the relationship between the pension plan and the plan sponsor. Stated differently, these pension plans already are creatures of the plan sponsor, they're creations of the plan sponsor. All we're asking is that with regard to funding policy, that the plan sponsor be a participant.
Okay.
Is that a fair characterization, Michelle?
Yes, Mr. Richards, we can certainly run this by our Attorney General counsel, but to Chair Brainerd's point, I think that most of these boards already have sponsor representatives on them. They're intimately tied together, given that the sponsor contributes to the plan. And finally, the FSRP requirement is already on the plan and sponsor. So this would mirror that.
Yeah, I think it would be a good idea to run it by the AG 1 and 2, quite frankly.
Happy to.
Other questions about item number 1? My hope is that we can work through each of these and then vote on them, reach a consensus on them, and then vote on them as a group at the end rather than one by one. On to item 2, increase sponsor accountability and tie funding policy and FSRP together. Michelle, can you briefly summarize that one, please?
Certainly. So there are 2 things here. First, the funding policy would be tied to the FSRP in the sense that if an FSRP were triggered, the plan and sponsor would now not only craft the FSRP, but also revisit the funding policy and together revise that plan. Second, the FSRP would need to be adopted by the sponsor's governing body, generally City Council, to ensure that the sponsor as a whole was involved and had ownership.
Thank you. Comments, questions? Asking plan sponsors to participate in ownership and needed changes. We did receive some helpful comments from members of the public on this. One of those comments is, why do we not have something in statute that says a plan sponsor would have to have the effect of the rate change approved and studied prior to implementing it, which is to say that right now, plan sponsors, city councils can make, for example, can make changes without requiring, without checking with the actuary and without evaluating the effects on the plan, but the pension plan does not have that luxury. And so we might wish to require the sponsor's governing body, such as the city council, adopt the FSRP through a resolution to help make sure that the plan sponsor is participating fully in the changes that are being made in the plan.
And that was something we found was very common in the other states we studied.
So I have a question, and maybe we can ask this of the AG's office when we ask them the issue posed by Mr. Richards. But is there a distinction between the sponsor's governing body adopting the FSRP itself through official action, as opposed to simply, I guess, consenting to or acknowledging the pension fund or the pension board's adoption of the FSRP?
We can look into that as well. And I think, Chair Libby, just as a reminder, though, that the statutory requirement for FSRP is jointly on the plan and sponsor, meaning the product is a product of both entities. So in a sense, in my view, it already is their the sponsor's product.
And members, with this recommendation to add to Michelle's point, it would clarify, given as it stands today, when we receive FSRPs, we at times had to ask the system to clarify that it's a joint product if it comes from the system only. So in that sense, this is going to clarify the process as well.
Melissa Juarez here from the Attorney General's office. So yeah, I think definitely, I think it'd be worthwhile that when you're making recommendations for legislative changes, that you ask for it to be as clear as possible, not leave any ambiguity. And that's what I would recommend. And if it's a question of the language requiring that it be adopted by by a local entity, it probably would be worthwhile to make it clear that it be done at a meeting or something in that regard, something to that effect.
So right now it's a joint product of the sponsor and the plan itself, but there's no official requirement that the sponsor formally adopt the FSRP. And so it's being done at staff level.
It's typically we're receiving a document from the plan, which in many cases includes a signature of someone employed by the sponsor, but many do not. So this would, our goal here is to allow the plan and PRB and stakeholders to know that the plan, the FSRP was vetted by the sponsor, that they as a whole have committed to it.
Okay. I'm fine with that.
Other comments or questions on item 2? If not, can we move to item 3, please?
Yes. So item 3 relates to the threshold, target, and trigger. In here, the committee brought the threshold and target from 40 to 30 years, adopted a tiered trigger, if you will, so that plans that receive evaluation over 40 years or between 30 and 40, but have a funded ratio lower than 65% would, as of 2025, become immediately subject to the FSRP. Then plans between 30 and 40 years with a funded ratio of 65% or higher would still be on a schedule of consecutive valuations. So 3 or 2, depending how frequently they conduct them, to trigger an FSRP. And then finally, there is a component here to ensure that plans that have made reforms that utilize ADC-based components and show that they are moving using a closed period towards full funding would not become subject. And the goal there, the committee, I believe, was to ensure that a plan like Fort Worth that had gone through several years of negotiations and key votes would not have to start over from scratch, knowing that they would eventually end up in the same place or closer to full funding.
Michelle, one of the comments that we received from the public was that we don't change the trigger for an FSRP, to keep the over 40 years as the threshold, which was part of the trigger since the creation of our funding guidelines. And then in 2025, that trigger is scheduled to bring that trigger down to 30 years when the funding policies require plans to be at 30 years. Is that one of our options here, is to simply leave it as is until reaching 2025 and then we move to 30 years?
My interpretation of what we have done would essentially be the same, meaning given that we've said effective 2025, so, the 40 becomes 30, but the law doesn't require that to be the goal until 2025. Am I expressing myself in a clear way, Chair Brainerd? I don't know if I'm understanding your point here now.
So you're saying that if we do nothing, that we will arrive at that in 2025, that 30 years becomes the threshold.
I'm having some difficulty with your audio, Mr. Chairman. I apologize, but I believe we agree.
Okay, sorry. Does this board need to make a change in order to reach a 30-year threshold by 2025?
A change to what we have presented here? No.
Okay.
And again, this is Marcia Dush. I understand this is, our goal here. I can support the goal in 3, but I would, again, reiterate my comments that I would like to see the legislature work with those plans who are already have adopted or are going to be working on an FSRP in a serious way, to somehow work with them so that that they have some sort of grandfathering protections.
Chair Brainerd, members, Anumeha Kumar, I just want to make sure with this proposed recommendation, so as we understand the intent of the committee that's being presented to the board, there and based on what we've heard from the committee members today, the PRB updated its funding guidelines in 2017 and stated that the 30-year threshold essentially is not going to become effective as a guideline until 2025. The committee has attempted to make sure that that promise is kept through this recommendation, which is suggesting that in a tiered approach come 2025 is when the 30-year is gonna become effective. And then what we also heard is some grandfathering for systems that have made a serious attempt to adopt an FSRP and are working towards a goal, or the ones that are going to before 2025, to create some type of grandfathering for those systems, as well as the example that Michelle used with regards to Fort Worth.
Thank you for clarifying that. Comments or other comments or questions on item 3? Okay, item 4, timelines and consequences. Can you briefly summarize that, Michelle?
Yes. So the first provision relates to how long is allowed for development of the FSRP. And we have 2 alternatives here. The first allowing 1 year, currently statute provides 6 months, and the second allowing 2 years. That goes together with clarifying I think it would be appropriate in the case of 2 years, maybe not 1, that future actions such as votes would have to be taken versus, currently it's common that we receive FSRPs that are contingent on a vote happening in the future, which is difficult for us to evaluate, given that key actions haven't been taken yet. So that would help tremendously with that problem. Next, the time frame with the 10 years currently in statute, which has also been a bit tricky. I think both for plans in some cases and staff, would be shortened to 2 years for making the changes. And then finally, the revised FSRP, and now we're on second revised with some plans, would go away, and instead, if a new FSRP were required within 10 years, the idea would be that that new plan needs to have some much stricter measures, and we've detailed some of those here.
Thank you. So staff has presented us a choice here. Right now, the threshold time frame is 6 months, and staff has suggested either extending that either to 1 year, but also require progress update at 6 months, or alternatively, as shown on page 56, allow 2 years rather than 6 months, with a series of other qualifications and requirements. And if you read some of the comments, I think that there's a pretty strong case to be made for giving plans ample time to work through this. Personally, I'm comfortable with the second option, allowing 2 years with some of the additional requirements and qualifications. Comments or questions on that?
Vice Chair Brainerd. So do we need to, as a board, decide whether we want the 1 year or the 2 year provision, or are we just going to approve this and send it to the legislature as a recommendation that they could choose either the 1 or the 2?
Ms. Dush, my understanding is that we're preparing recommendations here, and so that we would recommend to the legislature either A or B.
All right, and I too would favor the 2 year.
Okay.
I favor the 2 year as well.
Great. And Chair Libby, I appreciate the work that you've done on developing that 2 year option. Comments or questions on this item 4? If not, Michelle, can you move on to item 5, please?
Yes. Finally, we take up documentation, and this is another rather important one because we've had difficulty evaluating FSRPs that don't include an aggregate analysis of the various changes, showing how the combined impact would result in meeting the target. So this would require that analysis to include an actuarial projection that shows the unfunded decreasing to 0 within the required time period. And a commenter had recommended that the plan and sponsor, who are again both jointly responsible for the FSRP, should share the cost of that analysis, as well as we would clarify that assumptions used must be made in accordance with ASOPs.
So I have a clarifying question on this one. Would the requirement be that they only show the aggregate analysis of the multiple changes, or would we ask them to show an analysis of the individual changes themselves and then also an aggregate analysis?
Thank you. I am going to Kenny on this one.
I think sorry, this is Kenny Herbold. I mean, I don't think it's necessary to show the impact of the individual changes. What this is trying to address is that we have received some FSRPs that only showed the impact of the individual changes without taking into account the aggregate impact. So if you adjust the retirement age, it has an impact of Y. But then also if you change the average salary calculation, it has a different impact of X. Right, but together they may not have. You can't just add those together and say, okay, this one reduces the amortization period by 5 years. That one reduces it by 6, and say now we're down 11. Our amortization period is now 11 years lower because they have because they interact in a different manner once you put them together. And so we have received some that don't show us how these are expected to interact, and we're trying to get to a point where all of the analysis will show us now we have, this is the new plan, what is the ultimate impact of the new plan going forward? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess I was just curious to the extent that not all the changes are implemented either according to the same timeline or, once again, if, some are in any way dependent on future action and they didn't come into being, if it would be beneficial to have the information both on an individual and aggregate basis, just to determine, those impacts because of those reasons. But I completely defer to you all for what you believe is the best way for this information to be presented so that the plans can be adequately evaluated.
Thank you, Chair Libby. And go ahead.
This is Anumeha Kumar. Chair Libby, to quickly add to that, as we've been implementing this law for 5 years and based on our experience, this recommendation clarifies or help clarify the law as far as the information that the PRB receives. And we want to be mindful of the cost associated with these analysis for the systems. And so we're trying or attempting to ask for information that would be most useful to us. And from a cost perspective, if Kenny, you can jump in, if conducting individual analysis, which I'm sure if systems are considering reforms or changes, that actually probably goes through that process. But at the end, as far as sending information to us, we want to keep in mind that from a cost standpoint, it doesn't cause too much concern to the systems with the documentation that they have to send to us.
And this is Marcia Dush. Also, if we go with that second option, the 2-year option where all of the future actions have actually been approved, then I think we alleviate some of Chair Leiby's concerns.
I agree with that.
I wonder if one of the actuaries in attendance can clarify the difference between an actuarial analysis and an actuarial projection, because one of the commenters suggested an actuarial projection is not needed and is rather expensive. Marcia or Kenny, can you speak on that?
Taylor Lynch calling on a recorded line for Bank of America, Maryland, the North Collins Financial Center. Are they responding to who they're interested?
Hey, I have to call you back. I'm in a conference. Can you call me back this afternoon?
Yeah.
Ernest?
Sorry. Okay. I think he's muted now. So this is Kenny Herbold again. So I think the distinction that was that the commenter was attempting to make was that if you have an amortization period calculation included within an analysis, that gives you an expectation, right, of when the plan will be fully funded, versus having to provide the full details of what that projection looks like, showing every single year, showing the unfunded every single year for the next 30 to 40 years. And I think that the difference between these two is that showing that additional projection, showing the details associated with how you get to the 30 or 40 year amortization period that you're calculating can add to the cost of to the analysis itself.
Thank you. Other questions or comments on number 5 here? Okay, hearing none. It feels that we've got a consensus. Is there anything in any of these staff recommendations that anyone has questions or concern about? I'd like to give members of the public, folks in the audience, another opportunity to weigh in, having heard our discussion. If there is anybody who wants to share your thoughts about the direction that we are headed, now is your opportunity. Hearing none. I'd like to entertain a motion to adopt the legislative recommendations, incorporating any changes that we've agreed on. I think we've made at least one change or agreed to one of the alternatives in item number 4. So I'd like to entertain a motion to adopt what staff has recommended concerning the funding policy and the FSRP requirements. And I'd like to ask staff to work with the board and committee chair to finalize these recommendations for publication in the PRD's upcoming biennial report.
This is Marcia Dush, so moved.
And this is Stephanie Leiby, seconded.
Thank you. It's been moved and seconded. Further discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say nay. The motion passes unanimously. Thank you. And next, we've got public retirement system reporting and compliance. I'd like to ask Anu to update the board on that, please.
Sorry, thank you, Chair Brainerd. I was muted. This is one of our regular compliance report, which includes the over 60-day non-compliant plans list and a total net assets report. Unfortunately, we ran into some technical issues with our database that prevented us from putting this report together in time for the board packet. But please know that we are continuing to monitor the non-compliant plans and to send out reminder notices, and we will make sure to include this report at our next meeting. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Questions on reporting and compliance? And thanks for the update, Anu, no worries. Madam Chairman, that's all for the Actuarial Committee. We know we got into some gritty details here. We appreciate the board hanging with us. That concludes our report. Madam Chairman, you are muted.
Sorry about that. Thank you for that. Next on our agenda is the investment committee matters. And for that, I will call on Christopher Zook to walk us through those matters.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. So for the investment committee matters, this is a result of a tremendous amount of staff work and truly a team effort between the committee members and also the staff, who probably did above and beyond. And as you can tell by the length of this overall preparation package, it's a tremendous amount of information. So we had multiple meetings since our last full board meeting. We reviewed all the investment performance reports, and a couple things that we realized from this is that the legislature really moved the needle on this, and we now have an excellent platform to be able to consistently inform and educate the board, as well as also provide great data and education for plans and sponsors, and to be able to look at best practices, something that we thought might be the case, but we really are seeing that come to fruition, and that's a really good thing. So what we have in the packet today is the aggregated information based on the reports received. We've got to consider some potential legislative changes, and then basically a summary of the most common findings, and again, that emphasis on best practices. So I think everybody's going to really benefit from this process, and I think we're going to continue to really grow and improve it over time. But I think it's going to be very beneficial to, obviously, ultimately, the stakeholders of each of these plans. So I'd like to call on Robert Munter to provide the update, please.
All right, thank you. All right, thank you, Chair Zook. Yes, my name is Robert Munter. I'm the investment analyst here at the Texas Pension Review Board, and I will be presenting the PRB's draft investment performance report, which will start on page 80 of the packet. So the PRB is required to submit an investment performance report that both compiles and summarizes the information from the evaluations under Senate Bill 322. And the PRB is asking the board today to adopt the report that is required by statute and the legislative recommendations if they accept the recommendations that were adopted by the investment committee. And on the next page. So real quick, as just a brief overview of Senate Bill 322, it ultimately required systems with assets of 30 million or more to hire an independent firm with substantial experience to ultimately evaluate the appropriateness of the plan's practices and policies, and to make recommendations to improve those practices. And the recommendations for improvement were a big part of what we thought was the overall intent of the bill, as Chair Zook mentioned, right, to improve the understanding across all the systems and to make improvements. On the next slide, we have a overall review of what we have received so far. So per the PRB's records, 62 plans have assets of at least 30 million based off of our data there, and adjusting for those evaluations where one evaluation would cover multiple plans. An example is that the evaluation for ERS also contains JRS and LECOs. 55 evaluations were expected. The PRB did receive 2 additional evaluations from systems with less than 30 million in assets. And so far, on the next slide, there is a bit of an update here as to the plans that had not sent in their evaluations to the PRB. Earlier this week, we actually received a finalized version from Harris County Hospital District, which is the second one on the table here. The remaining 3 systems then, the evaluations there for Corpus Christi, Midland Fire, and Nacogdoches County Hospital District have been in contact with the PRB. And both Corpus Christi and Nacogdoches did explain that they are experiencing COVID-related delays. And Corpus Christi did provide an update that they are expecting to have the evaluation completed and submitted to the PRB by the end of the year. And then Midland Fire and Nacogdoches County have not provided an expected completion date at this time. And if we go to our next slide. So again, just a real brief overview. The evaluations here, right, were to evaluate the systems and look at their practices, but ultimately, again, it was to make recommendations for improvement. And this is where, right, the legislature for Senate Bill 322 will be a real help to the systems and improving the transparency as well as improving their practices. And this is coming from the evaluations being able to, one, make those recommendations for improvement, but also when they are providing examples as to how and what systems are doing well, it's an opportunity for those good practices, those best practices, to be something that other systems can look to and take from others. So overall, both the breadth and the depth of information resulting from the evaluations allow all stakeholders an opportunity to learn from the practices of others and ultimately raises the bar of existing practice in Texas, which is the biggest benefit here. And then on page 85 of the packet, we just have an overview here of the evaluations. And so this is looking at the evaluations with recommendations and those without. So what we received from the evaluations was that there were 30 different evaluators that conducted them. The majority of those evaluations, 39 of them, were done by the existing investment consultant, and 14 were done by independent third parties. And what we see here in this graph is that over half of the evaluations did have at least one and usually contained many more recommendations. But the main takeaway from this also is that the independent third-party evaluations had the highest probability of including an actual recommendation. And right, with these evaluations and the intent, right, to make recommendations for improvement, right, it's interesting to see that it was the independent third parties that were almost always providing some form of a recommendation there. And then for our next slide. And so just to provide a bit of an overview here, our report examined over 200 recommendations that were identified from the evaluations. The PRB categorized the recommendations into the 5 statutorily required areas I mentioned before. Many of these recommendations, of course, cross multiple areas, but we grouped them as best as we could to find themes and overarching areas that systems could most improve on, which I will cover in the next 5 slides. But overall, I would say if there was one clear theme throughout the recommendations, it's related to investment fee improvements. While this is not evident in the graph on this page, fee-related issues actually appeared in 4 of the 5 areas, which speaks to the importance of investment fee review and documentation in the eyes of the evaluators. And we'll cover that a little bit more when we start going through the actual recommendations and the most important ones that we've identified and are contained in our report as well. So if we go to the next slide. So here on page 87 of the packet, so beginning with the category of the investment policy statement, annual IPS review is one of the top recommendations across all 5 areas. As the IPS is the foundation for an investment program, it is an important document that needs to be kept up to date to reflect current practice. And this was a common recommendation made, as well as something that was generally identified with systems following best practices when the evaluators were providing justifications. And as I mentioned previously, fees were featured in a number of sections, including the IPS, and this is pertaining to the written fee policies. Evaluators stress that fees must be reviewed regularly, comprehensively, and to document the fee policies in the IPS. Comprehensive fee review requires systems to not only assess net of fee performance, but also to additionally understand transaction costs, custodial fees, and other fees that impact the total fund. Some of the larger systems use trade cost analysis in order to further analyze and understand these fees because of their importance in their evaluations. And while investment returns are in a large part out of a system's control, investment fees are something that systems can have a lot of impact on, which is why many recommendations are related to investment fee reviews and documenting them in the IPS. And then for our next slide. So for moving to the next area of asset allocation review, including risk, a major focus was on the need to consider the system's liabilities rather than taking an asset-only approach. And while the evaluations were not consistent with the definitions and terms for the studies or analysis, there are a few things that we learned from the evaluations. Almost half of the evaluations noted that the system was performing asset liability analysis, while almost all systems were conducting asset allocation analysis. And the asset allocation analysis would be towards that asset-only approach. According to the evaluators, asset liability analysis should be used by the systems to determine what are the appropriate risks and target allocation levels for the system based on considering the nature of the liabilities, cash flow, and liquidity concerns. And that it was important for the systems because of the information that they can learn from them and how that can help improve the system overall. And then for our next slide. So in the area of investment fees, the evaluations consistently commented on the importance of utilizing quality benchmark comparisons in many areas, including fees. Industry and peer benchmarks were a common focus in many evaluations, which encouraged their use as better data fosters better decisions, which was commonly identified by the evaluators. Many systems were found to have opportunity for improvement in this area as they were not benchmarking against peers or industry averages to ensure their fees were reasonable. And one evaluation specifically noted that monitoring net performance relative to peers is best practice. In our report, we provide a summary table of the resources that were identified in the evaluations to help systems find other resources they might not have known about, right, which is one of the benefits here from these evaluations. And as Chair Zook mentioned, based on some of the recommendations and comments made by the evaluators, it was apparent that Texas plans lack a Texas-specific benchmark resource, which is something that the PRB could provide in the future, right? Taking all the information from these evaluations to help raise that bar and provide these benefits to all the systems. In addition to creating the evaluation requirement, Senate Bill 322 also significantly enhanced fee transparency in Texas. Over the past decade, public retirement systems have increased their allocation to alternative investments, while at the same time raising concerns that expenses for alternative investments are opaque and greater fee transparency is in this asset class is desired. The new requirements to list all direct and indirect fees was also called for in evaluation recommendations. So these changes will ultimately improve systems investment fee reporting, enhancing transparency, and better allow for peer comparison in the future. Another area evaluators discussed was the use of passive investments to reduce fees. Several evaluations provided detailed discussion on how passive investments can help reduce fees and create advantages for the system. A few systems evaluations provided both great examples for how they approach passive versus active managers, providing examples, and interestingly, one system shows very low fees compared to peer benchmarks, approximately in the range of 20 basis points. Resulting from a majority allocation to passive, while another evaluation shows how transitioning from approximately 1% active, or excuse me, 1% passive allocation to almost 50% passive allocation has helped reduce investment fees by almost 40% for the system. Additionally, by using passive investments, which are less complex, allows systems to and their boards to focus on other aspects that really matter to them. And for the next slide, page 90. Moving on to the investment-related governance, the most common representing approximately 10% of all recommendations related to roles and responsibilities. And investment fee review or responsibilities around fees represented approximately half of these recommendations. So this was where either the recommendation specifically called out to investment fee review to be improved or referenced a role that that they were looking to have further defined or explained in the IPS, but through context of the evaluation, it was related to investment fee review. And this is an important recommendation, as having clear roles and responsibilities documented in the IPS is crucial for our system to effectively delegate. With the IPS being the guiding document, roles and responsibilities must be well detailed for all involved parties to understand who is responsible for each component of the overall investment program. A thorough IPS that fully details the roles and responsibilities for all key positions that serve the system will be less prone to operational issues and will aid trustees in understanding the expectations of each role. And then finally, on the next slide, in the area of investment manager selection and monitoring, evaluators emphasized the need for systems to review investment performance on a net of fee basis. The recommendations for including net of fee information generally identified that systems were either receiving only gross of fee performance metrics or were inconsistent in their use of net of fee information. And tracking performance net of fees is an important part of assessing the benefit of active strategies in particular. Without proper data to justify an active investment, systems could be allocating capital to active investments that would be better suited for another active manager or a passive strategy, as identified earlier with the systems considering and using those passive investments. When choosing actively managed over passive investments, systems need to ensure that they are receiving performance net of fees that justifies that selection. Monitoring performance net of fees is best practice. but most importantly, it provides a clear metric for understanding actual performance of an investment. Not understanding the impact of fees on the performance of an investment can be detrimental to an investment program. And identified in one evaluation, the CFA Institute and GFOA, which are two best practice industry standards identified in these evaluations, do mandate monitoring and reporting procedures be outlined somewhere in the IPS. And the IPS should specify that performance reporting include net of investment management fee data. And one of the most common recommendations overall was to also improve the investment manager hiring and firing process. The recommendations focused on explicitly stating the selection and performance review criteria when the IPS or within the IPS, and documenting all hiring and firing decisions with a clear rationale. And most evaluations identify that systems use their investment consultants to assist in investment manager searches. Because many systems rely on their investment consultants, specific practices were sometimes not included in the IPS. Again, both the CFA Institute and GFOA provide guidelines and have best practices for these. The desired criteria also would reference back to net of fees and using quality benchmarks, which are important recommendations that I identified earlier in other sections. And then that concludes the section concerning the analysis. So for the next slide here, this is now for the legislative recommendations. And so again,
Tell you what, Robert, if I may, I'm going to interject a couple of thoughts just for the benefit of the board and I think for all the listeners, from the plans and the stakeholders. One of the things that you've done an outstanding job of is talking about how much good information we were able to glean from this, and because it's such an overwhelming amount of information, I'd like to highlight basically two major things that I heard you say that I think bear repeating. The first of which is the most recent thing you talked about regarding net of fee and gross of fee reporting. To just make it really clear, the only thing that matters is what we can eat. It doesn't matter what's there before the fees are there. The net of fees is the only thing that we can actually spend, the only thing we can use to meet our obligations with. We need plans, and we were surprised by how many plans do just evaluate managers based on gross of fees. It can't compare an apple to an orange. What is it we can actually eat? What is it we have available to spend for our plans is what should be considered. The second thing along with that, it's actually very similar, is the asset only analysis versus the asset liability analysis. Only looking at what the asset allocation is going to do, only looking at what it's expected to do, without considering the liabilities of the plan and the cash flows of that particular plan, considering funding and obviously distributions for stakeholders, it's just half the picture. And again, we were surprised by how many plans just look at their asset allocation analysis to be able to say, this is what we think we're going to do compared to our funding requirement, and it's just half the picture. So, the team at the PRB has done an outstanding job of compiling all of this so that each of the trustees on this call or anybody who listens to this later can really evaluate how your specific plan is operating compared to what would be considered best practices, and also hold the consultants and the other service providers accountable for why you do it a certain way and how is the best way in their mind for your particular plan to operate. So, Robert, great job on that. I wanted to interject that before you go on to the legislative recommendations.
Chris, this is Marcia Dush. I'd like to amplify your comment about asset liability studies. Again, having been in the actuarial consulting business for over 40 years, it used to be that asset liability stochastic modeling was extremely expensive. But the fact of the matter is today, the cost of doing those studies is really been reduced. They've got much better models. And again, for me, particularly because we're dealing with many mature plans that have negative non-investment cash flow. It is so important because short-term, near-term liquidity requirements do affect the outcome so greatly. And so I just think if a plan's actuary isn't able to provide easy access to an asset liability study or work with your investment consultant in order to complete an asset liability study, I think there's something wrong, especially for any plan that's managing over $100 million in assets.
Thank you very much for your thoughts. Any other comments before we turn the floor back over to Robert? They're great comments, Ms. Dush. Thank you. Robert, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. Okay, so now this is going to be the start of the legislative recommendations. So as Chair Zook mentioned earlier, right, the legislative intent was to help provide more transparency on board activities with respect to investment governance and decision making. Many of these evaluations clearly provide a very useful resource for understanding a system and their decisions. Again, this will help all systems and not just those being evaluated. However, systems still look for clarity about what should be included in an evaluation. And the opportunity provided by these evaluations is for systems to have a comprehensive review and communicate to others what investment decision-making practices they are doing. And the following legislative recommendations and the next 4 slides here are those adopted by the investment committee and are being presented to the board for consideration and adoption. And if we go to page 93 of the packet, for the first legislative recommendation, this recommendation is to amend the statute to require evaluations to detail justifications for a recommendation as well as for no recommendation needed. So on our earlier graph, we showed that over half of the evaluations provided recommendations for improvement. These typically provided good details explaining the need for recommendation and justifications. Evaluations, though, that did not contain recommendations generally supported their conclusions with explanations as to why current practice was in line with leading practices, and therefore no improvement was necessary. However, there were evaluations that made no recommendations and provided little justification as to why. And the investment committee requested staff to work with those systems and their evaluators. And based on the feedback that we provided and worked with those systems and their evaluators on, many systems provided updated evaluations. So far, I think we have received 5 updated evaluations. And the updated evals we have received look very informative, and some provided new discussions that were very useful and were cited in our report because of how much of an improvement and how much additional content and what it can really provide to all systems. And so that is the first legislative recommendation. And then any comments on this before I continue to the next one?
And I would suggest that we do it the same way we did before on actuary, where we talk about these a little bit as we go, so it's fresh in our mind, and then we'll vote on them, as a group if there's consensus, or individually if necessary. But questions or comments on recommendation number 1?
Okay, then we'll continue to the second recommendation is to require a formal review and comment process prior to final publication. Current evaluations aren't clear as to whether system boards have reviewed the evaluation and are considering the recommendations contained in the evaluations. About 3 or so evaluations identified that systems were making changes or approved recommendations made in the evaluation. And this was very helpful in understanding what, if any, changes were being made. So what this recommendation then looks like is, first, the evaluator provides their independent review and any recommendations to the system. Second, the system reviews and acknowledges receipt and submits comments or noting any anticipated changes as a result. And then the final product then is both the independent review and the written response from the board. The benefits are that the evaluation can remain independent while giving the system a chance to comment on the evaluation and noting any changes that they are going to make based off that evaluation. So this will help improve transparency, giving stakeholders insight into the impact of the evaluation. And then the next recommendation.
Well, before we go there, Robert, any questions or comments on recommendation number 2? Hearing none, move forward.
Okay, so for the third recommendation, the committee is recommending that the legislature should consider the feasibility of precluding a firm from that advised or advises the system on its investment practices and policies from conducting the evaluation of those policies. Upon review of the evaluations, the committee noted that the data appears to suggest that existing consultants may be less likely to identify areas for improvement, whereas third-party evaluators almost always offer a recommendation. A third-party evaluation presents the opportunity for providing a new perspective or a fresh set of eyes, if you will, to analyze a system's investment practices, including the work of the current consultant, which is not possible otherwise. The committee acknowledged that due to cost concerns, the current law allowed systems to engage their existing investment consultants, and hence is asking the legislature to consider alternative methods to implement this policy. And then any comments?
Sorry, Robert. Members, I wanted to quickly mention that one option that the investment committee looked at for local plans was the idea that plan sponsors could potentially pay for these evaluations, but the recommendation that's before you is broader, so for the legislature to be able to cover other alternatives. Thank you.
Questions on number 3? Go ahead, Mr. Brenner.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I appreciate this recommendation. I understand why the board is not proposing to require this. My hope is, though, that the legislature will require pension funds to require the use of a separate independent firm. We're only really going to get an objective review when we have someone that does not have an existing relationship with the fund. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brenner. Any other comments or questions? We will proceed.
All right, so then for the final recommendation, this final recommendation requires evaluators to identify their qualifications and potential conflicts of interest, as well as codifying the PRB informal guidance. So several evaluations did not clearly explain if any existing relationship with the system existed, or did not explain how they met the experience requirement outlined in the statute. The committee noted at its September meeting that including a statement acknowledging any potential conflicts of interest makes certain all stakeholders are fully aware if the evaluator is potentially reviewing policies they helped the system develop. Understanding the nature of the relationship between the evaluator and the system being evaluated, especially if the evaluator is reviewing policies they helped develop, as well as knowing the qualifications of the evaluator, provide stakeholders a clearer picture of exactly who is performing the evaluation, which allows stakeholders the opportunity to draw their own conclusions regarding the analysis provided. As noted in the report, many of the evaluations performed by existing investment consultants were thorough and educational. So this is not implying in any way there is an issue. It is simply to make sure all stakeholders have the full picture when reading the reports. And then as outlined in the guidelines, what would be required is disclosures for the evaluator's qualifications, relationship, and if they are the investment consultant, an acknowledgement of any potential conflict of interest. Third, it would also require identification of any remuneration received by the evaluator. And then finally, acknowledgement of no direct or indirect discretion of investments. Then any questions or comments?
Comments or questions?
I have a question.
Chair Levy.
For the conflicts of interest, how are those determined? Is there kind of a universal standard of some type of association that people default to when determining what rises to a level of a conflict, or are we talking kind of just like a subjective standard of conflicts of interest based on a prudent person standard?
Robert?
So yes, so for this, it's right. This is just a conflict of interest. It's something that's common in the investment industry to provide just outlining any potential conflict of interest. Right. Examples of this would be right if the one evaluating the system was an investment consultant stating right that they do have an existing relationship. So conflicts of interest, it can be a little bit general there, but it is a common practice in the investment industry that to disclose various forms of conflicts of interest that right can be something that the receiver of the report would want to know.
And I'll echo Robert. I mean, the most common ones are, of course, when the consultant's doing the report, evaluating and grading their own work effectively. Certainly, they're more subjective to your point. That would fall under the prudent rule of if it's the sister-in-law or brother-in-law who's doing the report of one of the board members, we probably ought to know that. So I think it's left generic because it'd be probably not possible to list every possible conflict of interest that could exist. But that certainly is the spirit, is to just make sure that the stakeholders as well as the PRB has the ability to evaluate, is there anything that would cause this report to be, in any way influenced by those conflicts?
Yes, yeah, and just to be clear, I'm fine with that. I do think that disclosure of conflicts of interest is very important. I think so long as there's an industry standard or an understanding of what's expected, I think, I'm comfortable with that. I would just hate for us to be in a position where people are not disclosing conflicts because, I guess in their mind it's too subjective or they didn't view something as a conflict when maybe industry standard would. So that was the only point behind the question.
Understood, and it's a very fair point. And assuming there is movement on this in the legislature, I'm sure that they'll have a say in how that gets crafted to try to be as clear as possible to avoid any ambiguity.
Chairman Zook.
I just have a question. This is Ernest. On the issue of conflict of interest, what is the implication if a party indicates there's a conflict of interest? Does that preclude that party from participating, or is it just a requirement to disclose there's a conflict and continue to work?
I think I'll speak, and staff can certainly echo this, but I think the answer would be it does not preclude somebody to do it, to do that work if there is a conflict. It's up to the sponsor and the board of that plan to determine if that conflict of interest would preclude them from doing that work or not. The key is for an independent person who's not party to those conversations to know that that conflict of interest exists, and it was viewed as being, still satisfactory for that person to continue on and actually do the work for them. So I don't think it would preclude someone. It would just mean it needs to be disclosed, and we need to be aware of it.
Okay. Just one additional question. Maybe somebody asked it. I stepped out to get a bottle of water. So the conflict of interest, is it objectively defined or is it a subjective definition?
So we did discuss that just a second ago, and to kind of summarize those thoughts, there are some things that are very objective, such as the existing consultant is doing the same report, evaluating their own work. And then there's some that are much more subjective. So we'll leave it to the legislature to decide how to define that in statute, but certainly industry standard conflicts are things that we would most likely want to be aware of in this context.
All right, thank you.
Chairman Zook, this is Marcia Dush. I would like to ask
Please.
a question. So the first thing I want to say is I would like to give credit to the legislature for 322, because I do think it does a great job of improving transparency, and the work that the staff and your committee has done to, with these recommendations, I also think is very good. Again, adding to transparency. My concern is, and it may not be a concern, so I would just like to know, we've improved the transparency, but how do these reports, can they be accessed by the members in particular? We've got members who are paying sometimes in excess of 10% of their pay into these plans, and they have a right to know that their money is being managed appropriately, particularly these funds with great unfunded liabilities. And so I would just like to know, how are these reports posted or available to members in particular, and plan sponsors as well?
Staff, I'll defer to you to how these are posted.
Thank you. I'll jump in here. There is a requirement in our governing statute for the Pension Review Board to make these and other reports that we receive from our retirement systems available on our website. There's also a requirement, which we will have to go back and double check, on the retirement systems to post on their websites, if they have one, any information that they send to the PRB. So again, we'll double check if the investment performance evaluations are included in that requirement, but certainly we can make these evaluations available on our website, which we are going to, as well as encourage the retirement systems to do the same.
Yeah, I think it would be really interesting or valuable for members if they see the evaluation and there are recommendations. I think, especially now that you've made this legislative recommendation, that they understand whether or not the system accepts the recommendation and moves forward on it.
Sure.
Thank you for your comments. Other comments on legislative recommendation number 4? Any other questions? So at this time, we will open up the floor to public comment. And I cannot recall from the very beginning, which was a while ago, if we have a pre-registered attendee for comment on this section. Ashley, do we?
Not specifically.
Okay. So we will open up the floor, and Ashley, correct me if I state this wrong, but you can hit *6 to unmute your phone, and then you may make comments. Comments will be limited to 3 minutes. Any comments from those on the phone?
Christopher, this is Kenny, staff actuary. While we're waiting for somebody else to see if there's any additional comments, I did want to jump in. There are a couple of additional sections of the report that we don't specifically have slides on. So it goes back to the question that Marcia had as well. We have summarized every single evaluation that we've received. So as part of the investment performance report, so what Robert has provided is the PRB analysis section where we went through the evaluations and identified the most common recommendations and talk about those, as well as having these legislative recommendations. We have a summary of each evaluation included in the report. So later in the packet and within this report, you can see that we have a summary that provides a very quick analysis of the evaluation from the PRB perspective, and then provides key aspects within that the evaluation, each evaluation included. So there's, we're trying to do that as a useful resource for the legislators or any other stakeholder that wants to get a real quick summary of what did the evaluation say. So we have those as well, in addition to, as Anu mentioned, the plan to post the full evaluation on our website as well. And then Robert mentioned this during his presentation. We have compiled all of the recommendations, not the recommendations, but the resources that were identified within the evaluations. And we're including that as a resource on our website. It's within the report itself, but it will be available on our website as well. So I just want to make sure that we get a full picture of what that report looks like and all the things that are going to be included in it.
And it is for the board members who have not looked through them, they are exhaustive. They're a tremendous amount of time, energy, and effort that went into compiling them, and they will provide excellent resources. And so for any of the plan sponsors or board members or members of these plans, beneficiaries of these plans that are on the call, we would strongly encourage you to go through and look and see how your individual plan compares to others that are either of similar size or that are bigger, in order to evaluate the best practices that you identify there, as it will help elevate the entire landscape of pensions in the state of Texas. At this time, I'm not hearing any other comment from the public. With that, any other discussion from the board before we move on the discussion points here? Okay, we'll move forward. Let's talk about what's next. We can actually show the draft investment performance report. Are we ready for a motion? And if you could clarify.
Thank you, Chair Zook. Like Penny mentioned, members, so following the presentation, we have a draft report included in the packet, as well as examples of the summary of the evaluations that we have put together. And ultimately, what we are requesting is, again, for the board to adopt the investment performance report that is statutorily required for the PRB to compile and summarize the evaluations received from the systems, as well as adopt the four proposed legislative recommendations. And we have a motion for that.
That's perfect. We are ready for a motion from the floor, please.
Okay, so at this time, the chair will entertain a motion to approve the draft investment report and adopt the legislative recommendations concerning the investment practices and performance evaluation requirement, incorporating any changes agreed upon by the board, and further direct staff to work with the board and committee chair to finalize the report in the agency's 2019-2020 biennial report.
I would like to make that motion. Yes.
Okay.
Mr. Zook will make that motion.
Second, Keith Brady.
Okay, thank you. The motion has been made by Mr. Zook and seconded by Mr. Brainer. Is there any further discussion from the board?
Madam Chairman, I'd just like to make a comment. I want to repeat Chairman Zook's comments that this is a treasure trove of information for those, particularly those funds and perhaps their consultants and managers as well, who are willing to take advantage of it. I also want to especially commend the staff, especially Kenny and Robert, for their work in disseminating this and distilling it down into comprehensible pieces. This is really a tremendous step forward for the PRB and for pension funds in the state of Texas. Thank you.
Very good. Any further discussion from the board? Okay, hearing none, we have a motion to approve the draft investment performance report and adopt the legislative recommendations concerning the investment practices and performance evaluation requirements, incorporating any changes agreed upon by the board, and directing staff to work with the board and committee chair to finalize the report for publication in the agency's 2019-2020 biennial report. All in favor say aye.
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 Opposed say nay. The ayes have it and the motion is passed. That brings us to the conclusion of our investment committee report, and now we move, oh, sorry.
Madam Chair, I'm so sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to quickly mention and echo comments made by the members, of course, but then also state that this was a brand new requirement, and the systems, of course, did a very good job of sifting through the requirement in a very short period of time and submitting the evaluations to us. So we just wanted on a staff level, as well as I'm sure the board would echo, thank the systems for their work as well. And staff, again, thank you so much to you all for appreciating the work that the staff has done. And to put this report together, it was really a team effort, of course, in addition to Kenny and Robert, our Deputy Director Michelle Cranes, as well as Ashley Rendon. They all really pulled together, given we did not have a whole lot of time to get the report done. So it's still, we were still working through the summaries, but I just wanted to thank staff for all the hard work they have put in.
Okay, very good. And thank you all. Okay, so that'll bring us to our next agenda item, which is the Education and Research Committee matters. And for that, I will call on Mrs. Dush.
Hi, I would like to ask Brian Burnham to please give us a report on the MET compliance reporting.
I'd be glad to, Ms. Dush, thank you. For my report, I would actually like to move to item 7B, if that is okay, and it will kind of like encompass both 7A and 7B with my report. So for item 7B, we wanted to give a sponsor update on some new accredited sponsors that we have. So I would like to provide you with an update to our MET programs accredited sponsor list. Due to the pandemic causing cancellations of large in-person gatherings and tightening available budgets of systems, the demand for more online education options, especially continuing education, has been very high. To meet this demand, we're very proud to announce that we have accredited 3 new sponsors this year, and all of which are offering online trainings or webinars. Our new sponsors include 2 sponsors of online continuing education and 1 offering both core and continuing education. These 3 sponsors are BoardSmart, which is offering online continuing education in the form of expert talks in multiple topic areas. Our second one is the International Foundation of Employee Benefit Plans, which has been offering many of its conferences and other educational sessions that they normally do in large gatherings all across the country online this year, since the pandemic has affected their ability to hold the conferences in person. And FI 360 is holding a fiduciary essentials course for defined benefit plan trustees. And the course can be taken to satisfy all 7 hours of the MET core or 4 hours of the continuing education credit if the trustees are in their continuing education cycle rather than core. And its addition means that Texas now has another provider for the full MET core online besides our own free online training that we offer, which is something that we're very happy about and very proud of. We also wanted to make note that TechSpurs has rolled out webinars for continuing education training. And with that inclusion, these 3 new ones and the additional options from some of our already accredited sponsors changing around their programs, We've now have 7 sponsors that we are aware of that are offering continuing education in the online environment and 2 in the core environment, which is more necessary than ever nowadays to help our trustees keep their knowledge up to date and complete the required MET hours. And that will conclude my report on my prepared remarks.
Thank you, Brian. Madam Chairman, I will turn it back to you.
Okay, very good. So I think that'll bring us to our next item on the agenda, which is a possible Texas public pensions governance study. And for this agenda item, I will call on Mr. Brainerd.
Madam Chairman, thank you. I requested that this agenda item be added, and I've got a few minutes of prepared remarks if you and the board will indulge me, please. Those of you who attended the September 29th Actuarial Committee heard a lot of frustrations expressed by public pension plan trustees, plan sponsors, and administrators toward the PRB. Much of this frustration was directed at the PRB and the staff. As chair of that committee, my response to each person who expressed their views and frustration was to say that I heard them and I understood them, because I did and I do. I very much appreciate the perception and the reality of having a central oversight body like the PRB setting guidelines and recommending the legislature to make adjustments to future requirements as part of our core mandate. I realize, as I believe also my fellow board members do, that these guidelines have a meaningful impact on real people, particularly the trustees and staff of public pension plans in Texas. This board and the PRB staff are statutorily charged with monitoring the actuarial health of public pensions in Texas and studying problems that threaten actuarial soundness. We're doing our jobs. If it feels to you as if public pensions in Texas are spinning their wheels, continuously trying to get ahead but not getting anywhere, that funding conditions aren't improving significantly and actually are declining in some cases, while costs keep going up, while the PRB and the legislature advocate for changes that you don't find particularly helpful, you are not alone. I also recognize that, and I suspect some or all of my fellow board members do also. For all of the work of the PRB staff and this board, for all of the effort being made by public pension plans and boards and administrators and plan sponsors and service providers throughout Texas, progress feels painfully slow, if not elusive. Although there are some financial and economic reasons underlying problems facing public pension plans, the biggest problem by far, in my view, that is impeding the ability of public pension plans to improve their funding levels is governance. Public pension governance structure in Texas is exceedingly poor. And when I refer to poor governance, I'm not talking about public pension trustees and the decisions that they make. I'm talking about the legal arrangement that regulates public pensions in Texas. The problem is not one of individuals making poor choices. The governance problem I am referring to is systemic. This problem transcends individuals and goes to the laws of Texas. Those of you who are familiar with the book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, will recognize one of the habits. Begin with the end in mind. In his discussion of this habit, the author talks about putting your ladder on the right wall. You may be the best ladder climber in the world, but if your ladder is on the wrong wall, you're not getting ahead. That is an appropriate analogy for public pension plans in Texas. Our ladder is on the wrong wall. That ladder has been placed there by state statutes, and state statutes are not designed to foster public pension funding success. Speaking of beginning with the end in mind, no rational person would design a framework to govern public pension plans the way Texas has. The governance structure of public pension plans in Texas is deeply flawed and is the primary impediment to progressing toward appropriate funding of these plans. Until and unless this governance structure is fixed, the situation is not going to meaningfully improve. We're going to continue to be frustrated at the situation and with one another. Before I go into some of these governance problems, I will tell you there are two important exceptions to this poor governance arrangement, and those are the Texas Municipal Retirement System and the Texas County and District Retirement System. In my view, from a governance standpoint, these are model pension plans, and we could all learn some important lessons from them. I want to point out some of the reasons that Texas has a public pension governance problem. The statutory treatment of public pensions is inconsistent and is all over the map. The table of public pension statutes is included in the board packet today. I would encourage you to look at it. It presents the statutory framework for pension plans in the state. What the document shows is a complex and dizzying network of statutes that is uneven from one plan to another. Some pension boards have different levels of authority than others. Benefit levels vary widely. Entities responsible for setting benefits differ from one plan to another. Who serves on retirement system boards and how they are appointed varies widely. How benefits are funded varies from one system to the next. For some plans, adjusting benefits and financing arrangements requires legislative action, but not for others. Public policy ought to be consistent, and public policy on pensions in Texas is anything but consistent. With certain exceptions, there is no requirement in law that a primary objective of public pension plans that promise benefits be funded in an orderly and adequate manner. Many plans consistently receive less than their actuarially determined contribution. I ask, why is it okay to offer a benefit but not pay for it? There also is no requirement that the cost of benefits align with funding those benefits. For many plans, benefit levels are determined by one group and funding levels are determined by another group. The two seemingly never seem to come together, and there is no requirement that they ever do so. No incentive or legal requirement exists for plan sponsors to adequately fund benefits, nor for benefit levels to align with funding availability. It is not fiscally responsible and it is not conservative to offer a benefit and then not pay for it. That is kicking the can down the road, leaving someone else to pick up the tab. That tab will take the form either of higher taxes, higher employee contributions, or reduced benefits. The legislature oversees a statutory framework that allows many of the state's political subdivisions to fail to pay their required contributions year in and year out. The legislature also oversees a statutory framework that permits benefits to be promised without ensuring those benefits are affordable or sustainable. In a nutshell, Texas public pension regulatory framework lacks important elements of effective governance, namely accountability and alignment of stakeholder interests. Statutes leave lots of room for finger pointing and blame shifting, and they lack proper incentives for different stakeholders to reach a consensus. For example, for many local retirement systems, the process of making benefits and contribution changes becomes unwieldy, and statutes permit changes to be made either by the plan without consulting the plan sponsor, or by the plan sponsor without input from the actuary. These types of changes delay important reforms and often are unhelpful in moving toward full funding. Contributions often are negotiated, while benefits often are approved without being negotiated. This situation is exactly backward. Contributions should be non-negotiable. They should be the actuarially determined amount. Benefits is what should be negotiable. Around the country, there are states with well-funded plans and states with poorly funded plans. Texas is around the middle of the pack. But Texas lacks a roadmap to reach full funding. And more importantly, we lack a statutory framework to get us there. Without fundamental change, we will continue to muddle. We'll continue to be frustrated at the situation and with one another. The Pension Review Board is tasked with recommending policies, practices, and legislation to appropriate governmental entities. With this motion, I am proposing that this board direct the PRB staff to study and recommend improvements to public pension governance in Texas. My hope is that this study and its recommendations will result in a roadmap and the creation of appropriate incentives for all plan stakeholders to work toward truly fully funding public pensions in Texas. To be successful, this effort must include input from all stakeholders, including trustees, active and retired employees, plan sponsors, policymakers, and the public. Everyone may be asked to give a little. I would encourage everyone to think big and think outside the box. Public pension plans in Texas have been financially and legally neglected for too long. It's time to resolve this problem, and we need everyone to help make that a reality. Madam Chairman, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brainerd. I guess for now, do any of the other board members have anything that they would like to say on this governance study?
Madam Chairman, I'd like to make a motion that we ask the staff to prepare a study for presentation to the board and ultimately to the legislature 2 years from now that reviews governance of public pensions in Texas and develops recommendations for improvements to that governance structure.
Okay, very well. We have a motion, and is there a second?
This is Marcia Dash. I would second that.
Okay. A motion has been made by Mr. Brainerd and seconded by Mrs. Dush for the board to direct staff to prepare a public pension plans governance structure. Any further discussion by the board? Okay, hearing none, I'll just add that I too think that this is a very important kind of next step that will tie in tightly and is, in a lot of ways, direct feedback to some of the public comments that we had as we were walking through funding soundness restoration plans and funding plans. That there is a governance issue present with a lot of the pension plans that I do think needs to be addressed, and I think that this governance study would be a very good first step towards addressing those issues. So if there is no further discussion by the board, we'll now take a vote on the motion. All in favor say aye.
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 Aye. Opposed, nay. Okay, the ayes have it. The motion is passed. Next item on our agenda is legislative committee matters, and for that we will call on Anu to provide us with updates on these items.
Thank you, Chair Libby. Thank you, Chair Libby. Members, I first wanted to talk about the biennial report, which is a statutorily required report for the PRB to explain its work and findings over the course of the biennium leading up to session. It is a key report for the agency since the board is required to include any legislative recommendations relating public retirement systems that the board finds advisable. This report is presented to the legislature and the governor, and this year's publication will of course include the legislative recommendations that the board has adopted today in addition to including discussion on the activities that the board has engaged in over the course of this past 2 years. That's my quick update on the biennial report, and I'm happy to take any questions. If the members do not have any questions, I'd move on to the guide to public retirement systems. I wanted to provide a quick update on this publication, which is one of our important ones for the legislature. And as you know, This publication is a compendium of current public pension data and is a great reference document for the legislature to use for pension bills when they consider pension bills. However, over the years, we continued to nurture the guide and it grew into a 300-page unwieldy publication. In light of a great data center that we now have that houses most of the individual and comparative plan data that is covered in the guide, we are going to streamline and cut the publication to a more manageable size. And we are excited to continue to transition our publications, including the guide, to a more compact digital format. And that concludes my remarks on the guide to public retirement systems, and I'm happy to take any questions. Hearing none, I'll move on to the next agenda item, session update. Members, just to quickly inform you that the agency, or we had our joint budget hearing with the Legislative Budget Board and the governor's staff just this last week. And as a reminder, the Pension Review Board is making one exceptional item request concerning the restoration of the 5% reduction to the PRB's operating budget, which would allow the agency to maintain its current service levels by not having to cut an FTE position. A lot of the other agencies, based on what we heard at the hearing, are making the same request. And considering the unprecedented budgetary constraints facing our state, in developing this exceptional item request, the board, of course, was mindful of the budgetary constraints and decided to postpone the request for an IT upgrade of our legacy databases, which is long overdue and something that was discussed at the June board meeting. But I just wanted to include that as a reminder that we are not making the IT upgrade related request in this go around. But we would request the board to consider that again during the next budget cycle. And as far as the legislative session overall is concerned, members.
Anu, before, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Anu, but I just want to echo something that was stated much earlier, that as you make your case to the budget committee and as we move into the session, a great example of why that extra resource is needed is how valuable it would be to do that benchmarking study that Robert talked about earlier, to be able to give all of our systems the ability to know what is the average fee that they're paying as a total of their overall plan. All of the other benchmark kinds of things, what percentage of alternatives, what percentage of passive, what percentage of active, all of that being compiled takes hundreds of man hours per year at a minimum. And that to me would be a really good justification of why that 5% should be returned to the budget of the PRB. So, and I'm happy to be helpful in that regard.
Thank you, Chair Zook. We very much appreciate that. Members, moving on, as far as the legislative session overall is concerned, we are hearing different things, but just to make sure we share this with you, we are not sure what the format for next session is going to look like, whether it's going to be an in-person or a virtual or a hybrid session of some sort, given that the Capitol is still closed, but we will keep an eye, and of course we will keep you informed. If the members don't have any other questions, then I can move on to the next agenda item pertaining to our 2021 operating budget. And we are, of course, on track. And the legislature had asked agencies to figure out a way to give 5% back, and we are on track. And I just wanted to let the members know. And lastly, on staff update, members, we lost, since the June board meeting, we've lost 2 employees, And we are working diligently to, of course, fill those positions. But as mentioned before, we are going to continue to leave that 13th FTE position vacant, just to make sure once we have a better direction on where our budget's gonna stand, we don't want to take any chances given 91% or over 91% of our budget is tied to staff salaries. In order to make the 5% cut work, our only option is to go down an FTE, and we want to make sure that we are able to do that. So we'll continue to keep that position vacant. And that concludes my remarks, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, I guess hearing none, we'll move on to the next agenda item, which is a call for future PRB agenda items. If board members have any items that they would like to see on a future agenda for a board meeting. Okay, hearing none. Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry, I was getting off of mute. I would echo, it depends on staff availability and resources to do it, but I do think that it would be good to have a formal agenda item on there to indicate that we do want to be able to do these benchmarking studies, because it would add so much value to the plans of the state of Texas. Something for discussion of what that might look like, but it probably is going to be after the legislative session and we know what budget is, for the next 2 years.
Okay. Okay, moving on to the next agenda item would be date and location for future PRB meetings. I believe those are not, those have not been determined yet, but at least it's my understanding that the board as itself will likely not meet again this year. So our next board meeting will be in 2021. So for all of you, to the extent that we don't see each other again, happy and safe holiday season to everyone. And I don't know, Anu, do they have any committee meetings set?
Thank you. We do not have any other board or committee meetings scheduled for the rest of the year, but we are certainly going to reach out to the members to start scheduling in advance meetings, both board and committee meetings for next year. If there is a reason for the board to meet before session or in January of next year, we'll make sure that we make the members aware as quickly as possible. But at this time, I do not anticipate us meeting in January again, which means our next board meeting is probably going to be right after session in June. But again, we'll make sure we map that out and reach out to the members as quickly as possible.
Okay, very good. At this time, we will open it up for public comment to the extent that there are any members of the public on the phone who would like to provide comment to the board, either on any of the items that we discussed today or any other items that you would like to address to the board. Now would be the proper time to do so. Okay, very well, hearing none. Our next item on the agenda is the adjournment. So if there's no further business or discussion, the chair moves to adjourn the meeting.
I second.
Very good. The meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.